The sky was heavy and gray, like a giant blanket stretched over the world. It seemed like the clouds went on forever, covering everything in sight. The Pacific Ocean below was endless, stretching out in every direction. A few planes flew through the cold air, their engines roaring like hungry animals as they cut through the clouds. The wind was strong, making the planes shake slightly as they flew. Inside one of these planes, the crew was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. They were getting closer to their target, a tiny island in the middle of the vast ocean. The island was small, hardly noticeable from above, but today it was the most important place in the world. This was their mission. The island had to be taken if they wanted to win the war. Corporal James Turner, the tank commander, sat at the front of the plane, staring ahead. His hands were cold and stiff, gripping the controls of the plane. He could hear the engines rumbling, but inside the plane, everything else was silent. Every now and then, he wiped the frost off the small window beside him, trying to see through the snowstorm that had started. But all he saw was a world covered in white. The snow swirled around the plane like the storm was trying to swallow them whole. "Sir, we can barely see anything," said the driver, his voice shaky. He rubbed his hands together, trying to keep warm. "Feels like the plane will freeze any second." Turner didn't answer right away. He knew the weather was bad, but he didn't want to show any fear. "Keep going," he said in a calm voice, though inside his heart was pounding. They were far from the safety of the camp. If something went wrong, no one would find them. Not until spring. The plane flew on, the crew now only focused on the task ahead. They had trained for this moment, but training was never the same as facing it for real. The cold air was freezing their bones. The roar of the engines was deafening, and the tension in the plane was thick. Turner tried to breathe deeply, but the anxiety still clutched at his chest. But there was no turning back now. They were close, and the only thing they could do was keep moving forward. The tiny island was barely a speck on the map. From the sky, it looked like a small, forgotten dot in the vast ocean. Surrounded by water on all sides, it seemed so small and unimportant. But to the soldiers fighting in the Pacific, it was everything. The island's fate would change the course of the entire war. The island was covered with thick, green jungle. Tall trees swayed in the wind, and in the distance, the sound of waves crashing against the shore echoed through the air. The beach was quiet, but the tension was high. It was hard to imagine that just below the surface of this peaceful scene, an entire army of Japanese soldiers was ready and waiting for the attack. They had turned this tiny island into a fortress. On the beach, sandbags were piled high, and weapons were lined up, ready to be used. The soldiers who had been stationed there had dug in, making sure they were prepared for whatever was coming. They knew the Allies would try to take the island soon, but they weren't afraid. The Japanese soldiers were determined. They had fought hard for every inch of land they held. This island meant something big for them, and they were willing to die for it. The officers barked orders to their men, making sure everything was in place. They were ready. They had built defenses on the beach and hidden artillery in the jungle, waiting for the Allies to land. They thought they had the upper hand. After all, the Allies had been trying to capture this tiny island for weeks, but each attempt had been pushed back. The island's defenses were strong, but its small size made it even more dangerous. There were no places to hide, and the soldiers knew that once the bombs started falling, there would be nowhere to run. The island had been transformed into a battlefield, with every tree, every rock, every inch of land being used to their advantage. But as the planes in the sky continued their approach, something inside the pilots told them that the island's small size could be their biggest advantage. It wasn't the size of the island that mattered, it was what they could do with it. And for the first time, the pilots began to think that maybe, just maybe, This small, forgotten island had a bigger part to play in the war than anyone realized. The planes flew closer to the island, their engines roaring louder as they cut through the freezing air. The sound filled the cockpit, making it feel even more tense inside. The snowstorm was still swirling around them, making it hard to see, but they were getting close now. Soon, they would be over the island. Corporal Turner looked ahead, his eyes fixed on the small island below. He could barely see anything through the thick snow, but he knew what was waiting for them down there. The tiny island wasn't just a piece of land, it was the key to shifting the momentum of the entire war. If they succeeded, it would give the Allies a major advantage in the Pacific. But the risk was huge. They knew the Japanese had set up strong defenses, and this bombing run could either make or break their mission. The crew inside the plane was quiet, each of them focused on the task ahead. The pilots kept their hands steady on the controls, trying to guide the plane through the thick clouds. The air felt colder now, like the plane was cutting through ice. Every second seemed to stretch on forever. "Sir, we're almost there," the co-pilot said, his voice tight with nerves. Turner didn't answer right away. He just nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. The island was so close now, but the air felt thick with uncertainty. Was this the right time? Could they really do this? The plane shook slightly as they hit a patch of turbulence. Turner wiped the frost off the periscope, trying to get a better look. The island was now just a blur in the distance. It was hard to see through the snow, but he knew they had to drop the bombs right at that moment. If they waited too long, they would be too far from the target, and the element of surprise would be gone. "Ready," Turner said quietly, though his voice was steady. He wasn't sure if his crew could hear the nervousness in his words, but he wasn't about to show it. This was it. They had trained for this moment, and there was no going back. The crew braced themselves, holding their breath. The bombs were loaded and ready to go. As the plane flew lower, the crew members could feel the tension building in their bones. This was their moment, the one they had trained for, the one that would either turn the tide of the war or end in disaster. The island was getting closer. The countdown was almost up. "Now," Turner said, and the moment of truth arrived. On the island, the Japanese soldiers were ready and waiting. They had prepared for weeks, building strong defenses all around the island. The beach was lined with sandbags, and hidden weapons were scattered in the jungle, waiting for the right moment. The soldiers knew that the Allies were coming, but they were not afraid. They were determined to hold on to this island, no matter what it took. The Japanese officers stood in the middle of the camp, giving orders to their men. Their voices were firm, filled with pride and confidence. "We fight for our homeland," one officer shouted. "This island is ours, and we will not let the enemy take it." The soldiers around him nodded, their faces serious. They knew what was at stake. The soldiers had been through many battles, and they had fought hard to keep this tiny island. Some of them had been stationed here for months, while others had just arrived. But all of them understood that this island was more than just land. It was a symbol of their strength and their will to keep fighting. As the men got into position, they dug deeper into the sand and checked their weapons one last time. They were ready for the attack. The Allies would try to take the island, but the Japanese soldiers were determined not to let that happen. They believed they had the upper hand, and they had no intention of backing down. Meanwhile, in the jungle, other soldiers prepared hidden artillery, setting up powerful cannons in camouflaged positions. They knew the attack was coming from the air, but they also knew the Allied planes wouldn't be able to destroy everything. The jungle was thick, and the island's narrow beaches made it hard to land. They planned to use that to their advantage. The tension in the air was thick. The Japanese soldiers had trained for this moment. They had spent months getting ready. Their officers had drilled them on every move, every action. They were ready to defend their island. But as they stood in their positions, staring out at the ocean. There was a quiet sense of unease. They didn't know exactly when the attack would come, but they knew it would be soon. They could feel the storm approaching. In the air, the Allied planes were getting closer, but the soldiers on the island were prepared. They were ready to fight, ready to give everything to protect this place they called their own. The planes in the sky were getting closer to the tiny island. The crew inside the planes could feel the tension rising as they approached their target. The engines of the planes roared loudly, shaking the air around them. Inside, everything seemed to slow down. The crew members were staring at the island below, knowing that this bombing run was their only chance to make a difference. Then, everything happened in an instant. The pilot gave the order, and the bombs were released from the planes. There was a deep, thunderous sound as they fell toward the island below. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The bombs were falling fast, and the crew held their breath. They knew what was coming, but the force of the explosion still took them by surprise. Boom! The earth shook violently as the bombs hit the island. A massive cloud of smoke and fire shot up into the sky, as if the island itself had been torn apart. The sound was deafening, like the roar of a giant monster waking up. The shockwave spread across the island, sending waves of dirt, rocks, and snow flying into the air. Inside the planes, the crew members felt the explosion, even though they were still high in the sky. The shockwave rattled the plane, shaking everything inside. The crew ducked instinctively, even though they were safe in the air. Some of them yelled, unable to believe the power of what they had just done. "What was that?" the gunner shouted, his voice full of shock and fear. He could feel the tremors of the explosion in the plane, and it seemed like the whole world was shaking. Turner, the commander, didn't answer right away. He was staring out the window, his heart racing. The blast from the bombs had been so powerful, it was hard to believe what he was seeing. He had expected destruction, but the sight below him was beyond anything he had imagined. The island was covered in smoke and dust, making it almost impossible to see anything. The Japanese soldiers below had been caught by surprise, scrambling to take cover. The beach, the jungle, everything had been hit by the blast. Turner knew that the bombing run had done its job, but was it enough? Would the defenses hold? Would the island really fall? For a moment, everything went quiet. The roar of the engines faded as the crew waited for the smoke to clear. The world felt still, but only for a moment. The real fight was just beginning. The smoke and dust from the explosion began to settle, but the air still felt thick with tension. The tiny island, which had seemed so solid and strong just moments ago, was now covered in rubble. The ground was torn up, and fires burned in the distance. For a few seconds, everything seemed still, like the island was holding its breath. But then, something strange started to happen. The Japanese forces, who had once seemed so sure of their victory, began to hesitate. The sounds of gunfire and shouting started to die down, replaced by confusion and fear. The defenses that had been so carefully built were now in ruins. The soldiers who had been prepared for the attack were now scrambling, trying to regroup. It was clear the bombing had hit them harder than anyone expected. Corporal Turner, still looking out through the periscope, blinked in disbelief. He had expected destruction, but he hadn't expected this. The Japanese soldiers, once so confident, were now retreating. The strength of their defenses had been broken in an instant, and the Allies now had a chance to push forward. "Sir," the gunner said, his voice shaking. "Are they retreating? It looks like they're running." Turner didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure what to think. The island was in chaos, but he couldn't tell if it was victory or just confusion. It seemed like the island, which had once felt like an impossible challenge, was now falling apart before his eyes. "We've done it," the driver whispered, almost as if he couldn't believe it. His hands were shaking, but this time it wasn't from the cold. The fear had turned into something else, hope. Turner took a deep breath. The bombers had hit their target with perfect accuracy. The island's defenses were in ruins, and the Japanese soldiers were scattering. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it felt like the tide of the war was starting to turn. The Allies were gaining momentum. The planes circled the island again, this time slower, as they scanned the damage. The once proud defenses of the island were now torn apart, the sandbags lying in heaps, and the jungle filled with smoke. The Japanese forces were disorganized, retreating into the hills or trying to recover from the sudden attack. Turner's heart was pounding. They had done it. They had shaken the enemy, and the war was changing in that very moment. But even as the crew began to celebrate, Turner knew this was just the beginning. There was still more to do, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The real fight was just starting. The air was still thick with smoke, but the snowstorm had started to die down, and the quiet that followed the battle felt strange. The tiny island, once a stronghold of defenses, was now a scene of destruction. The fires were slowly dying, and all that could be heard was the soft crackling of burning debris and the wind blowing through the scattered trees. The ground was torn up, the sandbags knocked over, and the jungle was scarred by the explosion. Inside the planes, the crew members stared out the windows, their eyes wide in disbelief. The mission had been a success. It felt almost unreal, like a dream. The Japanese soldiers, who had once seemed so strong, were now retreating or hiding. The island's defenses had been broken, and the once mighty fortress was now nothing more than rubble. The men in the planes couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope deep inside them. Maybe, just maybe, this bombing run had done more than just destroy the island. Maybe it had changed the course of the war. Corporal Turner sat in the cockpit, his hands still gripping the controls. His eyes were fixed on the island below, but his mind was racing. He had expected this mission to be hard, dangerous even, but he hadn't expected this kind of result. He had been part of many battles, but this one felt different. The Japanese forces were retreating, their pride and their defenses shattered in an instant. The island, which had once felt like an impossible obstacle, now seemed vulnerable. They had done it. They had shifted the momentum of the war with one bombing run. "Sir," the gunner said, breaking the silence, "we actually did it. They're running. We've won." Turner nodded, but his face remained serious. He knew that this wasn't the end. There was still much more to be done, and the war was far from over. But in this moment, he allowed himself to feel a small bit of pride. They had taken a giant step forward. This was a victory, a turning point in the battle. But they couldn't forget that the enemy was still out there, and the fight was far from finished. The planes circled the island one last time, making sure there were no more threats. The crew watched as the last of the Japanese soldiers retreated into the jungle. The battle was over. The island had fallen. The crew could finally breathe. But the silence was heavy with the knowledge that more battles were ahead. Corporal Turner sat back in his seat, his heart still racing. He had no idea what would come next, but he knew one thing. This small victory would have an impact on the whole war. Back at the base, the crew of the tiny British tank was met with a strange mixture of confusion and awe. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was still cold and crisp. The men climbed out of their planes, their legs stiff from the long flight, and looked around at the soldiers who rushed to greet them. They were all eager to know what had happened on the island. Had the mission been a success? Did they manage to break the Japanese defenses? Corporal Turner stepped out of the plane, his face red from the cold, but his eyes were wide with disbelief. His hands shook slightly as he removed his gloves, still not able to fully process what had just happened. They had done it. They had bombed the island, and the Japanese forces had retreated. No one had expected it to happen so quickly, least of all the crew. For a moment, the soldiers stood around the tiny tank, unsure of how to react. Some of them were worried, some were confused, and others thought the crew might have gotten lost in the storm. But no one expected the kind of victory they had just achieved. "What happened out there?" an officer asked, his voice full of curiosity and concern. He was looking at the plane and then at the crew, trying to figure out what had gone so right. Turner, still out of breath, stared back at him. The question seemed simple enough, but the answer felt impossible. "We stopped a Super Panzer," he said quietly, still in shock. The words felt heavy on his tongue. He knew no one would believe him. At first, the other soldiers laughed. They thought Turner was joking. "A Super Panzer?" one sergeant chuckled. "With that little thing?" They couldn't imagine that such a small tank, one that had been laughed at by so many, could defeat the might of the German Super Panzer. But Turner didn't smile. He didn't laugh. His crew didn't either. Slowly, the camp grew quiet. There was a strange sense of disbelief hanging in the air. "Show us," another officer said, now taking Turner seriously. The crew led the soldiers out into the snow, following the tracks left by the tiny tank. The walk was long, but the soldiers were silent, their minds racing with questions. When they finally reached the battlefield, they saw the Super Panzer, the German monster of steel, half buried in the snow. Its massive form, once a symbol of power. Smoke rose from its engine, and the German crew was nowhere to be seen. The tiny tank had done what seemed impossible. The soldiers stood frozen, their mouths hanging open in shock. One of them even touched the Super Panzer's cold metal, almost as if to make sure it was real. "How?" a mechanic whispered. "How did your tank do this?" Turner simply shrugged. "It didn't sink," he said quietly. "That's all. We moved. They didn't." The soldiers stood in stunned silence, realizing that something extraordinary had just happened. The tiny British tank, which had been mocked and doubted by so many, had defeated the mighty Super Panzer. It was no longer just a small, insignificant machine. It was a hero, a symbol of what could be accomplished when the world counted you out.